we're back. Okay, good morning. So, if you weren't here last week, we just so happened to ask the most important question that you'll ever ask of your life. Not what you're going to have for breakfast, not even who you will marry or your career, what you will do for the rest of your life. We asked the question, how do we get into God's kingdom? And in the story of the rich young ruler, Jesus told us that we need to have childlike faith and follow him. We are to have complete abandonment of self to Jesus, who would not only ensure that we get into his kingdom one day, but that he would provide for us here and now. But unfortunately, we saw the rich young ruler walked away because not only did he idolize his great wealth and possessions, but also his own sense of self-righteousness. In contrast, childlike faith involves a love, and we said a treasuring of Jesus like a child would have for his or her parents. Now this morning we continue along the theme of God's kingdom by asking then, how then do we live as citizens in God's kingdom? If childlike saving faith gets us into God's kingdom, then that means we're citizens of that kingdom, but what does it mean? What does that actually look like? And some might argue and say, well, the kingdom's not really here, so how are we supposed to live as citizens of a kingdom that's not even here? Well, in one way it's not here, but in another way it is here. I know that's like a politician's answer. It's this paradigm called the already not yet, this paradox, the already not yet. We did speak about this earlier in our journey through the Gospel of Mark, 45 years ago. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but in summary, the kingdom of God at this stage is within us. Luke chapter 17, verse 21 tells us. And so we can say it's broken into this world, it's broken into our hearts in a spiritual sense. It's regenerated our hearts and we are sealed by the Holy Spirit. Sealed until the fullness of its revelation at the return of Jesus. So when he returns, Jesus will usher in the full physicality of his kingdom. But until that great glorious day, we are to represent that kingdom. So how do we do it? Well, think of it like this. Think of it when you got engaged. Some of you are engaged now, some of you will be in the future. But when you're engaged, your life changes, right? You don't continue dating people. Your engagement ring tells people that you are exclusively promised to someone else. And so you live like you're married, but you're not really married. We don't engage in honeymoon activities before we are fully married, until we are officially married. And so while you are engaged, there are certain things that we have to put off. There are certain old practices that we put off. There are certain voices that we can't listen to, like our Western culture that says, please, why wait? That's so archaic. In fact, marriage is becoming more and more archaic. Just do whatever you want. No, as Christians, as believers, as citizens of his kingdom, we want to honor God by obeying his will for marriage. And we want to respect our spouse by practicing self-control or whatever it might be, so that we go into marriage one day with a clear conscience before God and before our spouse. Now, in the same way, if we are citizens of God's kingdom, there are certain things that we have to put off from our old citizenship in this world and embrace a new mindset and new practices as ones now who belong to God. Now, the way we are going to specifically look at how we are to conduct ourselves as citizens of God's kingdom is in the area of leadership. So we're going to touch on leadership a bit this morning. Now, we're all leaders, and it's true of all of us. Whether you are here as a believer or a non-believer, we are all leaders because we all lead ourselves first and foremost. By and large, most of the decisions we have made are due to us. And sure, we can say, maybe some of them were influenced by circumstances. Maybe some of them were influenced by advice that we got. But at the end of the day, we made the final call. We made the decision. Our morals, our values are a result of us leading ourselves. We lead our families. We lead in our various organizations, whether you are, lower management or upper management or the top brass at the top, whatever it might be. But if we are citizens of God's kingdom, and therefore we are here to represent God's kingdom, what does that look like? How do we lead? So my argument is the kingdom we are affiliated with, the kingdom where we find our identity, that's going to affect how we live and how we lead. So we're going to have a look at Mark chapter 10 from verse 32. I'm not going to read the entire portion in one go. There's quite a bit, but we're going to make our way through it systematically. And so before we jump in, this is how I would summarize what we're going to look at. This is how I would look at the logic and try and understand the logic of what Jesus is going to say to us. To live and lead as a citizen of God's kingdom, we have to put off an old secular mindset and put on a servant-minded mindset despite suffering until glory. To live and lead as a citizen of God's kingdom, we have to put off the secular mindset and put on a servant mindset despite suffering until glory. Now, I know it's quite a mouthful, and probably the only thing you heard there was suffering. But Jesus did tell us last week in verse 30 that as citizens of his kingdom, that he would provide for us. He would provide for us community, land, provision, but he said there would also be persecution. Because in this current world, there are two kingdoms warring for the affiliation of our souls. And the good news is that the kingdom of light is the one that wins at the end of the day. Which means the good news for its citizens is that despite the persecutions and despite the trials that we will go through, despite the hard times, we will always have this indelible hope of being in glory one day. So here's what we're going to do this morning. To live and lead as a citizen of God's kingdom, we must firstly put off the secular way, and then lastly we will look at putting on the servant way. So let's put off the secular. What do I mean by that? We use the term secular to denote all things opposite to spirituality. The secular or worldly mindset is fixated with the things of this world and the ways of this world. The secular mind has a different set of morals and values and ethics. In speaking about leading, the secular-minded person has a different set of priorities when it comes to leading oneself or in a particular organization. In contrast, as Christians who have placed our faith in Jesus, his kingdom and his presence has broken into our lives spiritually. And so we are now to conduct ourselves in this secular world, in a worldly world, with a spiritual mindset, a spiritual orientation or disposition. His rule and his kingdom ethics now have to shape who we are and how we do things, how we go about doing things. But unfortunately, it's not just like the, flick of a button, switch of a button. This is going to take some work. It's going to take us cooperating with the Holy Spirit within us in putting off these worldly, secular ways and learning and embracing the way of Jesus and his kingdom. And the first thing we are to put off is fear and doubt in Jesus. And the reason why I say that is because Jesus' way of doing things, and therefore his kingdom, is very countercultural, is very counter-secular. So have a look at verse 32 with me. It says, and they were on the road. So remember last week, Jesus just had his conversation with the rich young ruler, and then they continued on their way, and they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they, being his disciples, were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. So we've got to get a picture of this in our minds. Jesus, like we said, has just answered the most important question that we can answer. How do we get into his kingdom? By having childlike saving faith. And with that now said and done, he decides it's time to intentionally move to Jerusalem for the very last time. And so I picture Jesus here with a very steely, determined look in his eyes, and that's making him walk faster than the rest, who have a mix of emotions. Mark tells us they're amazed and they're afraid. Maybe they're saying to each other, well, hey, I don't get it. If he goes to Jerusalem, things are going to go south very, very quickly. Because in Jerusalem, it's the epicenter of Judaism. It's where the Sanhedrin is. The Sanhedrin was this council made up of the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Sadducees who did not like Jesus. And so they're saying, well, but he's our Messiah. He's supposed to be our king. He's supposed to reestablish the nation of Israel. He's supposed to take out Roman rule. But if he goes to Jerusalem, this is not going to go well. And so they're confused. There's a lot of anxiety within them. And the thing that is going to help to fight off doubt and confusion in Jesus is to know that Jesus is on a mission and that we're invited to join his mission and not the other way around. Listen, doubt, fear, and confusion come in when we elevate what we think Jesus should be doing as opposed to what he is already doing. When we elevate our will for Jesus and not his will for us, in that gap is where fear and doubt and confusion comes in. And Jesus being Jesus, he knows this and he decides to remind them about his mission. He decides to remind them for the third time about his countercultural, counter-secular mission. Look from verse 32 again. It says, and taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, see, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise. Now, when you read that, Sunrise, whose plan does it sound like? Now, we know the religious leaders, we know they desire to kill Jesus, but at this stage, they don't even know how or when or by what means. But look at the incredible detail Jesus knows already. And notice how definite it is. Amongst other words, Jesus uses the word will there 4 times. He says, this will happen, and this is how it's going to happen. Incredible detail. And then he uses 7 verbs that must have sent chills down the disciples' spine. He talks about being delivered over, mocking, spitting, flogging, and eventually killed. But then one triumphant verb that crushed the other 7. He says, but after 3 days, rise again. But they didn't hear that one. They couldn't hear the most important one because the other 7 were bringing so much confusion to them, so much anxiety to them, disrupting their plans that they had for Jesus. So the first thing we are to do if we're going to live and lead as citizens of God's kingdom is to understand that we're invited into the will of God, not the other way around. We are graciously invited into the way of his kingdom that at times looks so completely different to this world or how we would go about doing things. So instead of fear or confusion when things don't make sense to us, we can know this. And this is going to sound very nerdy, but we can know that one verb took out 7 verbs. After they did 7 terrible things to Jesus, he rose again. Not even death can hold him down. Death, which is perceived to be so final, not even death can hold him down. In fact, their terrible actions only played into the will of God. And that through this horrendous torture and this horrendous murder of Jesus came about salvation for mankind. Came the way for man to escape sin, escape this secular world, and be a part of an eternal, triumphant kingdom. So, if you're having a terrible verb day, business is going downhill, finances are tight, or, I did this wrong and I did that wrong, and I don't know if the marriage is going to survive, or I don't know if my friendship's going to survive, or will I ever get out of this mental and emotional trap that I'm in? You can lead and you can live with assurance, peace, and hope because your King who rose has the power to redeem and turn things around. The next thing we ought to put off so that we can live and lead as citizens of Jesus' kingdom is self-centered ambition. Financial trouble. Kingdom-minded ambition. That company will come to an end when God decides to call time out on this current age. But imagine if that company that was providing employment and provision for thousands of people throughout the years, imagine if it also contributed towards the work of the kingdom. Because that which is done for the sake of the kingdom will continue for all eternity. We need to put off secular ambition because, ironically, it's too narrow-minded. I love listening to these stories of these self-made entrepreneurs, or self-made billionaires who had a vision, and through hard work they created something almost out of nothing, and now they have this huge multi-billion-dollar international company. It's amazing stories. I'm thinking, wow, what an incredible vision. And then, past this age, even the company Apple, It's outlived Steve Jobs, and most likely will continue to do so for some time. But even it will come to an end unless it's contributing to the work of Jesus' kingdom. I'm not saying Apple will go into the new heavens and the new earth, you know what I'm saying? But let's look at an example of James and John, who get their ambition a bit mixed up. Look at verse 35. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And I'm thinking, read the room, guys. Or read the road, whatever you want to call it. Everyone else is full of fear and anxiety. Jesus has just told them, hey, I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to be killed. And they're like, hey, but we want you to do something for us. So before we berate these guys too much, Jesus does invite us to pray. He does tell us we can make requests of him, and we will see that later in chapter 11. But it's the manner in which they ask before they even ask. We want you, King of the kingdom, to do for us, subjects of your kingdom, whatever we ask of you. And I'm thinking, well, shouldn't it be the other way around? Like when my girls come to me and they say, "Dad, don't say no, but we want more candy." And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, you're asking, but you're not really asking. Because by asking, that would imply that I have some options. But you've taken out half of my options. And because you've ruled out half of the options, that must mean that you think you're the one who has all of the authority. And so in the same way, it's like saying, so Jesus, great eternal King, we're asking you something, but we're not really asking you something. We just want you to do this for us. But Jesus is so incredibly patient. Look at verse 36. And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." We want to have positions of power when you are in your glory. And they had seen Jesus glorified. Remember back in chapter 9, he took James and John and Peter and he took them up the mountain and he was transfigured before them. And so they've seen the glory of Jesus. So they know, hey, something is up. And they don't just want to be in glory with Jesus. No, they want to have positions of power in that glory. But their understanding of Jesus' kingdom and their understanding of his glory is a little bit muddled up. They still think Jesus is going to somehow take out Roman rule and reestablish the kingdom of Israel and reign and rule as its geographical and political king. And they're thinking, oh, how cool would it be to be, ministers for him? Maybe you can be the minister of finance and you can be the minister of defense and we can sit on either side of Jesus. Think about it. After all, they've just been common fishermen their whole lives. Literally just trying to make ends meet. And now they suddenly see an opportunity. Here's an opportunity to be in a position of power. Here's an opportunity to be in a position to have some status, to have means, to have provision. Let's see how Jesus responds to this. Verse 38. Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you're asking." You boys don't get it. Then he says, are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? In other words, you guys still don't get what my kingdom is all about. My kingdom is far greater than just re-establishing the geographical and political borders of Israel. My kingdom is an everlasting kingdom that's going to be made up of all sorts of people groups from every tribe and tongue for all eternity. But to establish this kingdom and to play a part in this kingdom is going to involve suffering. And that suffering begins with me. Because when he speaks about the cup and he speaks about the baptism, he's referring to the suffering that he's about to endure in Jerusalem. And then he asks, are you able to do this too? And they rather naively in the moment, they say yes. Look at verse 39. And they said to him, we're able. And then Jesus said to them, he kind of subtly prophesies that yes, they will. The cup that I drink, you will drink, he says. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left hand is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. So Jesus here in his humanity, he says, hey, who sits at my right hand, who sits at my left hand one day is not up to me. It's up to my Father. That's already been taken care of. That's already prepared. But if you want to live and you want to lead in my kingdom, it's going to involve persecution and suffering. And James was the first of the apostles to be persecuted. We read about it in Acts chapter 12. And John, we think, was the last of the apostles to be persecuted. His was in the form of being exiled to the island of Patmos. And so we can kind of sum it up like this. We can say secular ambition has temporary satisfaction, but an eternal cost. Kingdom ambition, on the other hand, has a temporary cost, but eternal satisfaction. So how can we tell if we have secular ambition or kingdom-minded ambition? It's an important question to ask ourselves. Well, we may look at whether we're avoiding persecution or the cost of following Jesus in this world. But I would also suggest we look at our prayers. How are you praying? Jesus, don't say no, but I want you to do this for me. In other words, is Jesus the means to our end, or are we the means to Jesus' end? Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane is a pretty good example for us to follow. He asked, he said, let this cup pass from me. Suffering is unpleasant. Trials are unpleasant. Tough times are horrible. So follow his example. Pray, Jesus, please take this away from me. I don't want to go through this. But then he followed it up by saying, nevertheless, not my will be done, but yours. Do you see? Jesus was so ambitious for the will of his Father, which then brought about the eternal salvation of humanity. And so that temporary cost, as painful as it was worth it, worth the eternal reward. But now to live and lead as a citizen of God's kingdom is not just about putting things off, not just about trying to refrain from certain things. The best way to put off doubt, the best way to put off fear and confusion about Jesus, the best way to put off secular ambition is to replace it with a kingdom mindset and practices. So let's look at the last point. Let's put on the servant way, or let's put on the sacred way, we could say. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, whoa, Jason, I've heard about this whole Christian servant-hearted leadership deal. That just makes you a yes man. And if you're a yes man, particularly in my organization, that means you're going to be crushed. You'll be a walkover. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, well, Jesus, who just so happens to be the ultimate servant-hearted leader, was he a yes man? Yes, he was. But he only said yes to his Father. Jesus said, I came to do the will of my Father. Not everyone else's. I came to do the will of my Father. John 6:38 tells us. So the ultimate way Jesus served us was by obeying the will of his Father. Therefore, the ultimate way that we serve each other and wherever else the Lord puts us is by being obedient to the will of our Father. If we're asked to do something that goes against the Lord's will, we say no, because our servant-hearted leadership takes its cue from the values, the morals, the ethics, and the truth of God. Now what Jesus is going to do here is teach us the servant-hearted way of leadership in contrast to the secular way of leadership. So look at verse 41. And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And so here we go again. We saw this in chapter 9. They were arguing on the road about who was the greatest. And I mean, these guys are like kids. They're like children. So just before another argument erupts, Jesus interjects with verse 42 and he says, and Jesus called them to him and said to them, you know that those who considered rulers of the Gentiles, now pay attention to this phrase, just put it somewhere, lorded over them, and their great ones, put this one somewhere too, exercise authority over them. But, here comes the contrast, it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you. So see that Jesus never dismisses, he never rebukes the desire to be great. He never rebukes the desire to lead. It's just the way we go about it that is vitally important to him. So he says, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. So let's first understand the cultural, secular leadership style of the day. And again, I'm going to get very nerdy on you, just because I am. So you see those phrases that I said, lord it over them and exercise authority. Both phrases in the original Greek start with the prefix kata. Amazing, write that down. I'm just kidding. It means down. It means down. So, and I won't try to pronounce the rest of the phrases. But the first one means to have dominion down. And the second phrase means to exercise downward. And they're written in the continuous tense, meaning a constant, overbearing dominion over those under them. One scholar said it like this. He said that these men, these rulers of the Gentiles, continually tyrannize others, exploiting those beneath them, wielding power over them as tyrants. He says one thinks of men like Stalin and Hitler. Now, if we fast forward to our current day, we might describe this leadership style as autocratic. And it can come across in a variety of ways, either overtly overbearing and oppressive, or with a very subtle, passive, aggressive undertone. And people lead this way because either they believe their way is the best way. I have the superior knowledge in this matter, or I have the superior skills in this matter, therefore we should do things my way. And it might be true. There might be occasions where that is what has to happen. But to lead this way consistently will bring about an environment of overbearing control and oppression. Another reason why people lead this way is out of insecurity. They're insecure about losing their position of power or status or control. And so they come across overtly oppressive or passively aggressive. And so it's not a leadership style that inspires. It's rather a management style that restricts and confines and undermines, because at its core is self-centeredness. And self-centered leadership never breeds unity and respect, but always mistrust. I mean, the employee might stay in that company maybe because they're getting a good paycheck, but they'll constantly be looking for a better opportunity, and they will take it when it comes. And so Jesus says, this is not how it should be for us. Rather than arguing about who is the greatest, pushing each other down and arguing about who is the greatest, he says we are to take the mindset of a servant and a slave as a pathway to greatness or towards leadership. So in contrast to the secular way of leadership, which is top down, Jesus is saying we are to lead from the bottom up. Literally, the word servant is diakonos, meaning through the dust. Dia, through, konos, dust. We are to lead from the ground up. It was used of those who served tables in their master's house. Later, the church adopted the word which we now know as deacon. The church leadership position of deacon is derived from the word servant. And the word slave gets even more intense. It's the word doulos, which can be understood as bond servant. It means literally how it sounds. A slave has bonded or bonded him or herself to their master for life. It was possible in those days for slaves to eventually earn their freedom, to pay for their freedom. But there were some who chose to bind themselves to their masters for life. And Jesus is saying to us, that's the mindset we are to have regarding ourselves. This is how Paul and a host of other New Testament writers, how they describe themselves in the opening addresses of their letters. Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Jesus. We have bonded ourselves to Jesus for life. And that binding to him results in service, as Jesus says here, service to all. But that's where the challenge is, isn't it? We are to serve absolutely everyone. But how do we do this? Especially people who we think don't deserve it. And we think, oh no, they're just going to take advantage of me. They're not going to have any gratitude for it. What we need is a supreme example and a miracle. And both those factors are found in Jesus. Have a look at verse 45, our last verse. He says, "For even the Son of Man himself came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Jesus says, even. In other words, if ever there was someone with the right to have this autocratic, top-down, my way or the highway type of leadership, it would be Jesus, right? I mean, he's God. He's the sovereign creator of all things. He holds all things together by the word of his power, the writer of Hebrews tells us. And he could quite easily have said to us, but you guys messed it all up. And so here's what you're going to do. You're going to serve me and make it all right. But what does he do? He does the unthinkable. He comes down to the dust to serve us. He comes to serve the ones who messed up everything, including ourselves. He pays the ransom. He pays the price that we might be transferred out of the kingdom of darkness into his kingdom. He pays the price we deserved to pay. He pays, or he died the death that we deserve to die. And in doing that, we see both a supreme example of servant-hearted leadership and a miracle. I mean, what do you mean a miracle? On the cross, Jesus took our secular worldliness upon himself. He took our sin, he took our pride, he took our arrogance, he took our selfish ambition, he took all of our fears, he took all of our insecurities upon himself. Everything that makes us lead and conduct our lives in a secular, non-God glorifying way, he took upon himself so that we could be set free to now live and lead the servant-hearted way. Think about it. It takes incredible security to serve someone else. Incredible secureness in yourself to serve someone else, especially if you think they don't deserve it. A secureness that we can only get from Jesus, who was so incredibly secure that he could leave his glorious throne for all eternity and come down to the dust and serve those undeserving. Serve undeserving humanity from the dust up to the cross. It's only through the cross that we can experience, the miracle of forgiveness, and then a security, a secureness to be the servant of all and the slave of all. So, Sunrise, what is this going to look like for you tomorrow morning? What does living the kingdom life as a servant look like in your day-to-day life? I'm going to offer a very simple suggestion, so simple it might make you laugh, but on the other hand, it might radically impact you as an example of being a citizen in God's kingdom. And it might radically impact your relationships across the board. What if we simply started asking the question, hey, how can I help? How can I help? When you wake up tomorrow morning and you go off to work, how can I help? How can you help the cleaning staff? How can you help your clients, your boss, your colleagues? When you get home, how can I help? How can you help in the kitchen? How can you help with homework? How can you help your friend? How can you help that person in Foster's who can't reach the tin on the top shelf? If you're too short, don't worry, just walk on by. You know what will start to happen? We will begin to exude a warmth about us. We'll begin to exude a light or a saltiness in contrast to this world. And who knows, maybe it'll spark some questions. It'll spark some conversations that we can lead them to the one who ultimately served them with his life. So, who do you say I am? We can say, Jesus, you are the one who came to serve and not be served, so that we might serve you for your glory and for the good of each other. And in so doing, we show off your kingdom. Let's pray together. Father, firstly, we can't thank you enough for sending your Son to be the ultimate servant-hearted leader who served us to the degree of dying on the cross in our place. I'm not sure we will ever get our hearts and our minds fully around that until we are with you one day, when it truly sinks in about what you actually accomplished for us on that cross, Jesus. But I pray that you would begin to mold it more and more into our hearts and minds, that we would see you as the supreme example of what it means to be a servant-hearted leader, and that we would begin to do that. Yes, it might cost us. Yes, there might be tough times, there might be persecution, there might be trials. But we can see from your word that there is eternal reward. So please, Jesus, would you empower us to lead like you, to live and lead as citizens of your kingdom in this world. A very dark world that so desperately needs to see the light. And so as we go out of this building, or as we switch off the live stream, would you empower us to be your servant-hearted leaders? As we go off to work tomorrow and we face many, many challenges, would you give us the grace and the capacity to ask, hey, how can I help? So that people will begin to see you in and through us and come to know you and come to be a part of your kingdom too. In Jesus' name.